For posterity's sake, I noticed last time that when they made a recording of the lesson that I did during the rock concert, that the rock concert didn't come over the microphone. So if you find tonight that this just isn't working out for you, do your best to pay attention anyway, but then you can get the recording later and it will actually not have that. Because I was watching that video and I was saying, I'm complaining about a rock concert and there's no sound of the rock concert. But anyway, all right. So I do think, though, that on a regular basis, on some Wednesday nights, we should just open up all the windows and then sing as loudly as we can. In fact, point the pews outward so that they're facing outward. You know, if they can make a bunch of noise, why can't we make a bunch of noise? I wonder about that. But anyway, all right, tonight we're going to be talking about dating wisely. We talked last week about being the right kind of person as we approach dating, and the things that we talked about in that are things that are useful not only for those who are about to be dating or who are currently dating, but also for those who are married. We talked about having a good, solid character and the value of doing that. But we're going to be talking tonight about the other side of the equation, the other person that we're considering. And I'll begin, as I sometimes do, with an illustration that I understand. I'm not sure if your Constitution reads similarly to the Declaration of Independence, but there's a line in the Declaration of Independence that I wanted to draw our attention to this evening. This is, of course, one of the famous documents in my country's history. And there's this line in that document that says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," and the first of the truths that it names is that all men are created equal. All men are created equal. Now, as you consider that, I want you to think about two things in regards to it. First of all, yes, all men and even all women are created equal. When you consider yourself and when I consider myself, what are we? We are made in whose image? We know? We're made in God's image. We are made in the image of God. And so along those lines, we are equal, but in being made in God's image, we can also see that we are equally important. All right? Now, having said that, even though we are all made or created equal, we need to realize that in dating and marriage, not all people have stayed equal. In other words, one choice is not just as good as another. Two further facts that I want to consider stemming out of these things are this. First of all, as we mentioned in a previous lesson, there's no such thing, biblically speaking, as a Mr. Right or as a Mrs. Right. The idea that's popularized by Hollywood today is that you're looking for, in the process of dating, your soulmate. And along those lines, if you wind up marrying someone that isn't exactly right, if they're not your soulmate, if they can't see into your innermost self or whatever that means, then if someone comes along that meets that bill better or fits the bill better, then you can have a divorce or don't have a divorce, just leave that person and then go to that person. Well, that's Hollywood. That's not biblical. And it's not biblical to think that there's only one compatible person for you out there. In fact, we are dealing with a Bible context for the most part, and Song of Solomon is an exception. But a Bible context for the most part in which marriages were not a matter of choice, but a matter of arrangement. You didn't pick them. In fact, to help us to understand this principle, we're not for that purpose alone, but we are going to be considering an example outside of the Song of Solomon where a wife was picked for a man, and that man never even met the woman that he was going to marry until he met her for the first time, and they were then married after that. And so those kind of marriages could work. And that tells me that when I have a choice, when I have an option, certainly if I have a choice or I have an option, that should amplify the likelihood of my marriage working, not decrease it, as is so often the case today. But the reason that there are so many divorces is because people trick themselves into believing that if I haven't found the one who seems to be exactly right, then I can go and find that person. Well, along those lines, a second truth I want to point out to you that we haven't already talked about, and that is that some Mr. and Mrs. Rights are, in other words, more right than others. All right? Not everyone is created equally in dating. I don't know if you can see what he's got in his hand there. It's a gun, okay? So, not everyone is the best person for you along those lines. And so I want you to consider again this chart that we had a look at last week, and this will kind of be an ongoing thing as we go through these lessons. We want to choose excellent things for our lives. We want to have the best possible life that we can possibly have. And so along those lines, I want you to first of all see that it would be, in regards to searching for a marriage partner, it would be good, and by that I only mean not inherently sinful. Not inherently sinful to date or marry any eligible person of the opposite sex that breeds. In other words, anyone who is qualified to be married, in other words, they have never been previously married, or they have been scripturally divorced along those lines, and they're the innocent party, well, it would be good, as it were, to marry any one of them. All right? But as you and I both know, that's not really the best way to go about dating. I'll marry anything that breathes. That's not a good idea, okay? So, better than that, of course, would be to date and marry someone that you are attracted to and someone that you are compatible with. But I don't need to tell you about that. You're already doing it. That is, generally speaking, where people or how people go about the process of dating. That's where they stop when it comes to the process of dating. But I want us to see that there is actually even yet a better way than that. There is the best possible way. And that is to date and marry based upon a person's spiritual qualities first, and how their spiritual qualities interact with your spiritual qualities. And then, and in a distant second place, by the way, then and only then do you consider attraction and compatibility. It can be, like I've said last week, that you don't necessarily have everything in common with your future spouse. But if you have Christ in common, then I guarantee you'll have a successful marriage. If Christ is the foundation of your marriage, no matter what other problems come up, God will have already made a way of escape. And through the strength of Christ, you can find it. Marriages that are founded on Christ do not fall apart. It's only when one or both people remove themselves from the foundation of Christ that marriages fall apart. Now, I want to consider something outside of the Song of Solomon first to get us to thinking about this idea. Am I going about the process of looking for a future spouse the right way? Or if I am a parent or if I'm a grandparent, am I raising up my child to look for a spouse in the right way? Am I instructing my fully grown child as to how they should date in a proper way? Am I instructing my grandchild as to how they should date in a proper way? You know, I got an article in the email recently written by a preacher in Kansas, and he was writing about how the church needs more grandmothers. The church needs more grandmothers. And what he's talking about is Titus chapter 2, verses 3 through 4. More older women that are willing to take younger women aside and tell them how life works from the standpoint of knowing how it works because they've worked it out themselves successfully. The sad thing is that many grandmothers aren't getting that way. You find that grandmothers in the state of Kansas, where this preacher is, the prospect of those 30 or 40 years down the line, today in Kansas, if you marry, you have a 3 out of 10 chance of not divorcing. In other words, every 7 out of 10 marriages end in divorce in Kansas, and that's in the United States. But can we believe that as culture shifts around the world and as Hollywoodism and as this attitude towards marriage, that it is a dissolvable union, as that floats around the world, can we believe that it won't touch our shores as well? And we need to be aware of these kinds of things. Am I going about this the right way? Let's look at a search in the Bible for a spouse. I want you to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 24. Genesis chapter 24. Abraham is getting on in age, and before he passes away, he wants to see that his son Isaac is taken care of. He wants to find a spouse for his son Isaac. And again, in those days, that's the way it worked. It wasn't that Isaac would go out and date whom he would please. It was that rather Abraham would find a suitable spouse for him. Now, there were exceptions to this. We saw how in the very next generation how that kind of broke down after Isaac. Jacob, he went and found his spouse. Esau, he married people of the land that displeased his parents. But at this point in time, you have a father who is looking for a spouse for his son. What is he looking for exactly? Well, as we consider this in Genesis chapter 24, We see him making a covenant with one of his servants. He's going to send a servant, not even going to go himself, but a servant whom he trusts to find his son's spouse. In Genesis chapter 24 and verse 1, Abraham was old and well stricken in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house that ruled over all that he had, Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. It's a custom that's lost on us, but this is how they made a covenant or an agreement along those lines. What does he want? In verse 3, I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my daughters of the Canaanites, unto my son rather of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. But thou shalt go unto my country and to my kindred and take a wife unto my son Isaac. And so he's given his servant some instructions. Now, in Abraham's search and also, rather Abraham's request and also the servant's search, we're going to see some guidelines that both of these men used when they were thinking about who would make a good spouse for Isaac. How did they go about finding the right person for Isaac? They didn't think about Isaac's hobbies. They didn't think about the kind of personality traits that this woman would have, other than some very significant and key ones, and we're going to see in just a moment. So, as we think about these guidelines, first of all, you've seen one already. She had to be from the right family. She had to be from the right family. In verse 3, notice again that the wife was not to come from the daughters of the Canaanites. Why? Already Abraham was seeing in the Canaanites things that he didn't like. He was seeing spiritual characteristics, spiritual traits that were not admirable. Now, going over to where this wife is going to come from, they're idolaters as well. But the thing that he's going to do, the servant is going to do, is in the conversation that he has with this woman, frequently mention Jehovah God. We are not so far removed into the stream of idolatry that people could not remember who the one true God was. And so the choice that this young woman is going to be called to make is a choice for being with a family that believes in God. In effect, what exactly is she to be doing? We're going to see that in just a moment. What choice will she have to make? But second, I want us to see that God was to be involved in the process. Abraham involved God, and later the servant would involve God. In verse number 7, notice, the Lord God of heaven, which took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and which spake unto me, saying, and that sware unto me, saying rather, unto thy seed will I give this land. He shall send his angel before thee, and thou shalt take a wife unto my son from thence. Abraham saw God as being active in the world. Now, does that mean necessarily that God, and this is where some Christians kind of combine Hollywood and Christianity. Does this mean that God has sent his angel, as it were, and he has prepared one specific person for you, and you have to find that one person? Well, not necessarily. But what is a spouse? A spouse is a good gift, isn't it? The proverb writer Solomon said, whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing, and obtaineth favor from the Lord. A wife or a husband comes from God. It's a gift from God. And along those lines, therefore, yes, God does prepare someone for you if you go about the search in the right way. He has a gift waiting for you. It's not a specific person necessarily. It's a silhouette of what that kind of person will be, characteristics that person will embody. When the servant goes, notice what he does as he begins his search for this woman. In verse 12, we see him now arriving there in the land where Abraham had come from. And it says, O Lord God of my master Abraham, I pray thee, send me good speed this day, and show kindness unto my master Abraham. So what is he doing there? He's praying. He's praying so that, as we see in verses 13 and 14, he can find the right person. He wants to find the right person for Isaac. And God is therefore included. Any search for the one who will be right for you, I won't say Mr. Right or Mrs. Right, but any search for the one who will be right for you has to involve God. It has to involve prayer, as we see in this case. She had to do something herself. She had to act on faith. She had to be willing to obey the same call that Abraham himself had obeyed years ago. In fact, in verse 8, notice the agreement between Abraham again and this servant. Abraham is still speaking here in verse 8. And if the woman will not be willing to follow thee, then thou shalt be clear from this my oath. Only bring not my son there again. And so he had received a call from God to leave the land of his fathers, to leave his father's house, and to go into another country. And basically what he's saying is this: if she's not willing to do that same thing, then she can't be my son's wife. I don't want a woman from that place if she is not willing to take the same steps of faith that I was willing to take, and to leave her family, to leave idolatry, and to go and serve the God of heaven and earth. The fourth requirement, though, that the servant was looking for. Go to that prayer again in verses 12 through 14, and look specifically at verses 13 and 14. The servant is a servant, and we know that much. But it's interesting that he's actually also looking for a servant. In verse number 13, notice what it says: Behold, I stand here by the well of water, and the daughters of the men of the city come out to draw water. And if it come to pass that the damsel to whom I shall say, Let down thy pitcher, I pray thee, that I may drink, and she shall say, Drink, and I will give thy camels drink also, let the same be she that thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac, and thereby shall I know that thou hast showed kindness unto my master. Now, I don't advise your prayer taking that shape today. In other words, if this is to be the right person, then when we go out to eat together, let her pay and let her order dessert on top of that. You know, that's not the kind of prayer that we're to be shaping today. And we have to realize that this is in an era of time in which people communicated with God more freely than what we can understand today. Why? Because they didn't have this book. They only had God's spoken word to go on. They couldn't even read in the book of Genesis about themselves. All right? So they had this kind of communication with God. And so he prays to God, show me this. But what is he looking for? A woman who'll give me water. But more so than that, a woman who will give my camels water. Now, do you realize what he's asking for? I just found this interesting, and maybe I'm making too much of too little. But a camel can drink 30 gallons of water, which is 114 liters of water in one setting. Now, I don't know if camels are like cars, you know, if they get half full, quarter tank, or what it might be along those lines. But camels can hold a lot of water, in other words. And camels usually don't drink unless they're very thirsty along those lines as well. But do you realize also, therefore, that this servant had 10 camels? How many liters of water is she going to be drawing out of that well with that little pitcher that she's carrying on her arm? That's a lot of water, isn't it? All right? This girl is going to be a servant, have a servant's attitude. Because it would take a servant to be willing to draw all that water for a man and his camels who you just met for the first time. And that's the kind of wife that this servant said would make a great wife for Isaac. Now, questions for us along those lines is, first of all, are we looking in the right family? Now, you'll never hear me say that it's binding that a person must marry a Christian. But you'll hear me say every day of the week that that's the best thing to do. To look in God's family. To look inside God's family. And don't use the lame excuse, I'm going to put up here later, but that this person obviously has to have some personal characteristics besides coming to a building marked Church of Christ, all right? That there has to be more to it than that. But let that be where your search begins. Let that be where your search begins, and don't allow yourself to get into a relationship where you're heading towards marriage with a person that you can't share the most important thing in your life with. All right? I've got no problem if you want to try to convert somebody in the world before, and then bring them into the church and then marry them. I've got no problem with that, all right? More power to you if you want to do that, but don't start dating first. Because what will happen is that there will be things that will be promised before when you're dating a person in the world, And then when the rubber meets the road, as we say, or when it actually comes time for there to be marriage and then decisions have to be made, they'll be operating from a different rule book. And that's going to make your life very, very, very hard. And I've seen it happen too many times to say any differently along those lines. Second, are you involving God in your search by applying Bible principles and praying? God does speak about finding a spouse. There's a whole chapter, Genesis 24, about finding a spouse. And there are other passages that relate to it. We're going to see some this evening from the Song of Solomon. Are you listening to what God has said in His book to try to see what's the proper way of going about doing this? Are you praying to Him? Not praying for a specific person, but praying that you'll find the right person and have the wisdom to know that that is the right person. Third, are you looking for someone who has his hand to the plow? Are you looking for someone who is active in the church, who has a living faith like this woman had to have? Rebecca does make the decision to leave her father's house and to go with the servant. And if she hadn't had that attitude, that heart, then she would not have been qualified. What kind of heart or what kind of attitude are you looking for when you consider someone to marry? Are you looking for someone with a servant's heart? Are you looking for someone who is not me first? The world is very much a me first world. And if you have your priorities out of line, then you're going to find a successful businessman or businesswoman. You're going to find someone who's career-oriented, who's going to have a lot of money, who's going to bring a lot of prestige. You're going to have this massive wedding dinner, and everything's going to be very, very nice until you get 2, 3, 4 years down the road. And again, you're not playing from the same rule book because they're living for themselves while you're trying to live for God. A servant's heart is what you're looking for, or should be. Now, as we continue along this evening, we've been touched by obviously a story or an account of someone looking for a spouse for someone else. But let's now go to God's book on dating and on marriage, or courtship, as I like to call it in marriage. Courtship is more serious sounding than dating. That's why I like to use it. Because really, we shouldn't have the kind of mentality, and I know words are just words, but we shouldn't have the kind of mentality that goes with this world's dating habits. You know, oh, we're just going out to have a little bit of fun, and if it works out, okay. If it doesn't, that's not okay. You know, we'll just break up. It doesn't really matter. It should be that we take it more seriously, and that before we become, as it were, boyfriend and girlfriend, we're convinced that this is something that can head towards marriage. Now, it might not end up working out that way, but we should go into that relationship saying, this is a person that I can honestly imagine, as much as I know about them right now, I could imagine spending the rest of my life with them. It should be that that's how you begin this process, and that's more like courtship or a more formal dating process. Now, Song of Solomon is a much debated book. We haven't but scraped the surface in terms of touching on some of the verses last week. But let's introduce ourselves to it properly. And let's think about what this book has in it for us as it relates to this subject. There are a lot of objections and opinions about the Song of Solomon. You know, one objection obviously might be, who is Solomon to give me marriage advice? And you say, well, you know, isn't he the man, and you're right in saying this if you do, isn't he the man who ended up having 700 wives and 300 concubines? Obviously not a man who knew much about fidelity. Well, did you know that the Song of Solomon, it doesn't talk about all of Solomon's life? And it doesn't necessarily give any kind of discourse on fidelity. Yes, there are images and pictures of fidelity in this relationship, but that's not necessarily the reason that this book was written. And it's certainly not the only word that God has on marriage, as we're going to say later. Second, as you read through the book, if you already have, in my Bible it is only one page, it's only 4 pages long. In my Bible. You could have read that, and I encourage you, just read it, reread it. Maybe you have already. And maybe you've said, can the Bible really be saying all those things? Can those pictures, those images really be in God's book? You know, when I was a younger man, I did not have the best of upbringing, and I did not have the best, I didn't make the best choices in life. And one of the things that I did when I was growing up was I had no problem listening to music that had swearing in it. and neither did some of the guys that I went to church with. And we, at one time, were trading a CD, and a girl saw that. And she grabbed it from us and looked at the inside of it and saw the kind of words that were in that CD. And she said, "Are you guys supposed to be listening to this?" And I argued about, and again, this is pre-School of Preaching Patrick. This is Patrick, influenced by the world. I argued with her about freedom of speech. I argued with her about the point that, I'm a Christian and I'm not going to say these words, but that doesn't mean I can't hear these words. Are we going to be dishonest about what's in the world? The Bible realizes what's in the world. Have you ever read the Song of Solomon? And I actually opened up the Song of Solomon and I put it in front of her. And she read that and she was like, "Is that really in there?" She was shocked. She had never looked at it before. Well, it really is in there. But the question is, what does it mean? It really is in there, and it really should be looked at, but what does it mean? Third, the book is really talking about Christ and the church. That is not the standpoint from which we're going to teach this class. You're going to look at some commentaries, and in fact, you'd be surprised how many. And you'll open up a commentary, especially from 200 or 300 years ago. They really did not know what to do with this book. And you're going to read where, and I don't mean to be, we're going to have to be a little bit graphic just to talk about this book. But they'll talk about how two breasts symbolize the Old and New Testament and their place in the church. Now, where in the world would you get that in reading the Song of Solomon? You would not. You have to have a pretty fanciful imagination to figure that one out. All right? Did she have tattoos? No. All right? So you're going to see in commentaries a lot of avoiding of the subject, what this book is really about. All right, what is this book really about? Our approach to the Song of Solomon is going to be this. Song of Solomon represents a very real romance between Solomon and one of his wives. I wish I could say it was the only one of his wives. But of all the people who had enough wisdom to write this book, obviously God felt that Solomon had the wisdom through which his Holy Spirit could use this man to talk about what romance really is. And along those lines, I want you to see that God chose to use this very real romance to help husbands and wives understand two things. First, to help them to understand that sex is not wrong. But sex outside the boundary of marriage is wrong. All right? The rest of the Bible preaches a very solid message that sex outside of the boundary of marriage is wrong. And if that's the only thing that you heard, it could be that you walked away from the Bible thinking that all sex is wrong. But sex was created by God. The sexual relationship between a husband and wife was created by God. And like I've said before, He could have made it different. He could have had it be an entirely different experience. He knew what it was when He created it. And He wanted husbands and wives to be able to share that kind of love with one another. And with only one another. And so this is what it should look like. Second, along those lines, we see in this book how a husband and wife should view each other. Now, the images that are going to be painted in this book, when the wife speaks of the husband speaks of the wife, you're going to say, well, they're often fairyland, or else these are perfect people. But the reality is that they are real people. But as you grow in a marriage bond with someone, you see more and more of their imperfections, and it bothers you less and less. You see more things that they've got wrong with them, and you love them even more because of it. That's what marriage is. And that's what we see here in God's picture of marriage, where husbands love wives, honor, praise, adore wives, and where wives do the same to husbands. It is very, very popular in the church even today for husbands and wives to mock one another, to say bad things about one another, to joke about how much they enjoy time apart. And if you haven't, if you're saying, well, not in Jurong, I've heard it here, and you've told me the jokes. So I'm not going to point anyone out. I'm not going to name names along those lines. But think to yourself, is that what God wanted my marriage to be? There will be times where there are jokes, But the rule for joking is that both people have to laugh in marriage. If only one person is laughing, then there is something seriously wrong with that joke. You haven't learned how to love from God. Now, while Solomon and his wife do poetically, this is what I didn't point out to that girl. While Solomon and his wife do poetically, and I would mention also graphically, describe each other's bodies, the Bible does not detail their sexual activity. It's not a smut book. It's not a romance novel. It doesn't talk about the intimate details of the act itself. It just talks about the kind of praise that each was willing to offer the other. Now, you will see clues that they are talking about that during the act itself, perhaps. You'll see how in the language that he uses, he goes from at one point from her head to her toe. At one point he goes from her toe to her head. And describing her body. All right, he does that. But the sexual act is not described. And nor should it be. Not in that kind of way. There are room if you're, and we'll talk more about this next week when we talk about preparing ourselves for marriage and we talk about some of those practical kind of things. There's room, if your sexual relationship is not what it should be, to consider that from a Bible standpoint and make it what it should be. We'll be recommending to you a book that's been recommended to others along those lines next week. But along those lines, examining graphic details in a way so as to paint an image in your mind is not what God intended to do. Our approach again to the Song of Solomon is to note also that the book describes the courtship process of the Shulamite that took place prior to the wedding. Now, you're going to see in the Song of Solomon that there is most definitely a wedding. And before that wedding, you're going to be asking yourself, are they married, are they not? There are some commentators who view the book like I believe it should be viewed. They view it as a real picture of romance. And yet they say that before that wedding, that's talking about marriage. And really the wedding chapter is just a memory. I view it differently, and I'm going to present it differently. It might be that you study the book on your own and you say, well, I'm not really seeing that, Patrick, but that's okay. At the end of the day, what we can agree on is that this book does, in fact, talk about marriage. All right? I'm going to teach it this way, though. I'm going to say that it also talks about courtship. The book also contains practical advice as to how one should behave himself or herself before marriage, therefore. Now, a couple of things to realize also about this book. It was not written to uphold Solomon as a role model in every way. Solomon obviously had the wisdom, had the skill to write this book. And so God used him to write this book. But has God ever used people to write things or say things that they didn't fully understand or even that they didn't fully apply? Think about Acts 2:39, Peter. Peter is standing there and he says to this Jewish audience, the promise is to you and to your children and to all that are afar off. What was he actually preaching? He was preaching the including of the Gentiles. But then we get to Acts chapter 10, and the Lord says to go to Cornelius, and he's shocked. Go to Cornelius? What do you mean? He's a Gentile. What happened? God used him to speak the truth, but he didn't understand it. He hadn't applied it. And the same, I believe, is true of Solomon. God used Solomon to speak the truth on this subject, or really just to truthfully record what was happening between him and his wife. But that doesn't mean he's a role model in every way. Second, the book was not written to be God's only word on dating and marriage. There are a lot of other passages that need to be considered in order to have a complete picture of what marriage looks like, and even what dating should look like along those lines. And then finally, any comparisons between Christ and the church exist only because marriage is comparable to Christ and the church. You'll not see me pointing out the fact that any part of their anatomy is representative of anything in the church or anything in Christ. You're not going to see me do that. I believe that's a stretch. I believe that's a distortion of the Scriptures. And I find this very interesting, by the way. The Song of Solomon is not quoted in the New Testament. It is a standalone book to be used for what it is, not to be a sermon about Christ and the church. Okay, here's a simple outline of the book, just so you can know how this book divides. Verses 1 through 4, I believe that's sort of a flashback. I see that the marriage has already taken place. The wife is looking back and considering what she found when she found Solomon. In chapter 1 and verse 5 through chapter 3 and verse 5, I see in that courtship. I see in that this process of where they find each other, they get to know each other, and eventually that relationship grows to the point where I see that relationship developing into marriage. But key to this section of Scripture is a phrase, do not awake the love. Now, it's not translated like that in the King James Bible, but we'll be talking more about that next week. Key phrase, though, do not awake the love. Then, after that, in chapter 3 and verse 6, marriage and the honeymoon. The beautiful marriage between the two and all that would happen in a king's marriage. And after that, of course, the honeymoon, which inspiration, by the way, does not skip over. But along those lines, they're describing each other in detail, but not the sexual act. In chapter 5 and verse 2 through chapter 8 and verse 14, you see them as a married couple. You see conflict, you see resolution, and you see commitment. And we'll be talking about those things also as the class progresses. So, and I want to remind you that I will probably go fast through these slides at times. And I've said this all the time, and I'll keep saying it. These slides are yours if you want them. You just have to send me an email. Some of you have already done that, and I will send them to you. Song of Solomon, here's some more helpful hints in order to get into it, though. The Song of Solomon is a collection of mostly monologues. What's a monologue? One person speaking. I actually think that it's one person thinking. I think these two lovers are thinking about each other. And I use lovers in the biblical sense, a husband and a wife. They're thinking about each other. And you hear Solomon's thought, and you hear her thought. Maybe there's a conversation happening, but at times it seems like maybe not. There are times, especially on the honeymoon, where they're describing each other's bodies. Yes, I believe they're probably saying that to one another. They're probably speaking to one another at that moment. But for the most part, it's just one person talking rather than a dialogue where two or more people talk. Speaker will change from husband to wife without introduction or conclusion. And you'll have to think to yourself, who's talking here? I'll attempt at times to tell you who I think is talking here. I might be wrong. It's also the case that some commentators in this feel that see that there's a third voice, that there is an audience. You hear her speaking at times to the daughters of Jerusalem. And so maybe at times where you find yourself kind of bogged down, who's speaking here? Maybe it could be that the audience is speaking and responding to the picture of love that God is showing them. All right, let's talk first of all about seeing deeper than skin. As we think about finding the winners in life, finding the person who's going to help me succeed spiritually when I go about the process of courting and dating. As we think about beauty, have you ever heard this expression before? Beauty is only skin deep. Well, there are a lot of people who only see beauty as being skin deep. Now, in this part of the world, it doesn't seem necessarily always to be about how a person looks. That's only one kind of beauty. What can also be another kind of beauty? Race can be a kind of beauty. I know of some people who would think that for a person to marry outside their race, scandal, whore, shock. All right? I've even heard, and I don't think this is true. I mentioned this last year, and some of you got bad ideas about James. It wasn't about James, all right? But I heard someone say that in Malaysia, and it's not about James or anything about him at all right? I heard someone say that their mother had told them, you had better not marry an Indian. You had better not marry an Indian. And she actually had forbidden her to marry an Indian. What have they done in that? Well, they've excluded a race. What are they seeing? Skin deep. And not only race, but what about economic standing? It's often the case that people of like economic standing in Singapore seem to find their way to each other. Is that the way that it should be? Are those the kind of priorities that should exist where people of like economic standing, the same kind of money or money expectations come together? Well, no. That's just another form of skin deep. Education is another form of skin deep. Where someone says, well, I want someone who has attained this level of education, a master's degree at least. If he's going to be, a wife says, if he's going to be my master, he better have gotten his master's. All right, so he has to have enough education. Well, that's again just another form of skin deep. Now, some of these things do relate to compatibility. I'm not saying that interracial or intercultural marriages are easy. There have been plenty of times, I married an Australian, there have been plenty of times where we've been talking to each other, and I'll just say, what did you say? She'll say some Australian thing that I've never heard before. We've been married all this time, and here comes this expression that I didn't get. And I'll say something sometimes, and she'll say, "What did you say?" Because I've said some kind of American thing. All right? There are problems that come up when you have intercultural relationships. All right? But it's just a form of skin deep. Now, Solomon did have a skin deep reason to discount this woman. She's speaking here in Song of Solomon chapter 1 and verse 5. And she says, "I am black." Now that doesn't mean she's an African, all right? She's a Shulamite. She's a Jew. And other versions translate that better as being dark. We might better even translate it by saying tan. She's saying, "I am tan, but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. I'm not an unattractive person, but I'm tan. I'm not, you know, there are reasons to like me, but will he be able to get past the fact that I'm tan? Look not upon me," she says, "because I am tan, because the sun has looked down on me." Can you Asian ladies appreciate this? In America, it's the opposite problem. I find that very funny. In America, ladies all want to be tan. They would love to have your skin color. And they actually go to tanning salons. And they actually buy tanning cream. But then I go to the pharmacy here, and what do I see? Whitening cream. What does that say about ladies? They always want to be something else. That's what it says about ladies. Sorry, ladies. This lady looks at herself and she says, "I'm tan." And in those days, to be tan in Jewish culture was not fashionable. What did it mean? To be a fair-skinned woman meant that you had the privilege of living indoors. It meant that you had money. It meant that your family was successful. The Shulamite did not come from a successful family. In fact, why was it that she was tan? Continue reading in verse number 6. "My mother's children," other versions accurately translate that as sons, such as in the American Standard Version. "My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but mine own vineyard have I not kept." Now what is she saying here? She's saying that my brothers, we had a family vineyard. And why are the brothers in the picture here? It seems to me, and I might be reading into this, but it's quite possible that the father is not in the picture here. Has the father passed away? We don't know. But for whatever reason, she's taking orders from her older brothers. In fact, later on in the book, when she recounts the memory of her youth, her brothers had the guardianship over her. We're going to see that in chapter 8 when we get there. But she is ordered by her brothers to help, to support the family, and so she's out there in the field keeping the vineyards. And while she's keeping the physical vineyards, her own vineyard, her body, she has not kept. She has not been allowed the luxury of being fair-skinned. She's tan. So, now when Solomon looks at this woman, there was one picture. A beautiful but tan-skinned woman. And in that one picture, he could have seen two things. First of all, he could have looked at her and he could have seen that she's unattractive by today's standards. And I want you to realize that whenever you say that someone is unattractive, that it is by today's standards. Whereas it is totally unacceptable for anyone in this society to have a little bit of weight on them. If you go to some African countries, you scrawny women go over there, the men will not even look twice at you. Because to be fat is to be fashionable. To be fat is to be desirable. It's only the situation and the time. 50 years, 100 years from now, it might be different. So, along those lines, she's unattractive by today's standards. If she's like that now, what's she going to be like when she gets older? I better find a more attractive person. That's what Solomon could have seen when he looked at that one picture. But what would that picture be? Skin deep. He would only look at the skin, the surface. But you know what he could have also seen when he looked at that same picture? And what I believe he must have seen? You know, even though she's tan, she's still a beautiful woman. I can promise you that when I was growing up in the U.S., I did not imagine marrying an Australian woman. That was not the picture that I had in my mind. Never once. I never even once imagined being in Australia. I was not one of these people that picked a mission field. The mission field picked me. They invited me to come. I never considered going to Australia until I made my first trip there, and I only intended for that to be a campaign effort, and that was all. And so along those lines, there can be a lot of unexpected things that happen. Your image can totally change from what you thought it was going to be. But what does he see beyond that skin-deep image? She's got this tan because she was obedient to authority, because she was working for her family. Her father wasn't in the picture. Her brothers were giving her orders, and yet she listened to her brothers and worked this vineyard, and that's why she's tan, deeper than the skin. When we consider all that we've considered so far, we have been given three things to consider that are deeper than the skin. As we consider last week and this week, let's put the picture together. The first thing that we see her looking at or considering in this book is his character. And we talked about that last week. But in chapter 1 and verse 3, if you're not there already, chapter 1 and verse 3, remember what she said, "Thy name is as ointments poured forth." And we talked about how some versions translate that, "Thy name is as pure oil," purified oil. In other words, when you think about what it takes for oil to become purified or where that comes from, olives that are squeezed, purified oil, the idea of pressure producing something beautiful. And that's what his name is, character. He has real character. Look at his or her reputation. As you think about that person's character, you observe them in a number of situations, but you don't just trust your own view of their character. How do other people look at this person? It was the case when this woman considered Solomon in verse 4 that, or rather in verse 3 it should also be, I'm sorry, change that reference. "Therefore do the virgins love thee. Therefore do the women, the maidens love thee." He had a good reputation among those around. And you need to ask yourself, what kind of reputation does this person that I'm considering have? How do other people view them? Is it a good reputation or a bad reputation? Listen to your parents and friends. You know, and I'm really, I'm always walking the fine line of when I'm self-disclosing too much. And I never really know where that fine line is. Unfortunately, the Lord didn't give me enough of a filter there. But there were a couple of other relationships before Chantel that I wish there weren't. And you know, after those relationships came to an end, you know what my mom said? "I didn't like that girl." And I'm like, "Mom, why didn't you just tell me? Why didn't you tell me when I was going out with this girl?" Because what happens when you're going out with somebody? You get one picture, but because of hormones and because of youth, you see things perhaps that aren't really there. Trust the people who know you. Trust your parents who brought you up. Trust your friends who know who you are and have known you longer than this person has perhaps. Trust them and listen to them. And if they say, "He's not right," then say, "It's time to go." All right? Listen to them. If you find especially that both your parents and your friends are saying, "This isn't the right person," you ask them, "Tell me honestly," and they say, "This isn't the right person," then never even get involved in the relationship. It's good advice, I promise you. Third, see how he or she responds to authority. And we see this young girl listening to her older brothers who have apparently taken the place of her father. But in your context, what can you observe? You can see how they act at church. How do they treat the authority of God? How do they come before the throne of God? We talked about the need for men. Be presentable when you come to worship. Treat it with sobriety. Treat it with seriousness. Have the kind of attitude that is the supreme being, and I'm coming on Sunday to remember His Son and to honor my Father, my Heavenly Father. Do they have that kind of respect resounding in them? Also, do you see them having the proper kind of respect to their parents? If you're dating the kind of person who says, well, my parents have said this, this, and this, but let's do this instead. Watch out for that person. Beware of that person. You want someone who knows how to respect and honor their parents, because that's a good characteristic, a good trait to take with you into marriage. Having a proper respect. Employers, how do they behave themselves at work? Are they the kind of person that always sleeps in, that never comes to work on time? Are they the kind of person that's floating around from one job to the next? What makes you think that when they approach that kind of authority that way, they'll approach your relationship in authoritative bond with any more respect? So think about them and how they respond to authority. Let's say that you're already in a dating relationship. What now? We're going to look at some verses in the Song of Solomon, and what we're going to do is to consider along these lines. Now, I realize that it might be that this evening you're already going out with somebody. All right? Well, newsflash to you all. All right? The purpose of dating is not to save up enough money to buy an HDB together. That is not the purpose of dating. All right? Dating, courtship, is a trial run. Don't treat it like it's the runway, and that the inevitable conclusion to this courtship has to be marriage. If the flight is not going to make it successfully to the other side, which is heaven, abort the mission. Get out of there. You know, pilots, when they see that a wing has fallen off on the runway, they don't still attempt to take off. You know, they stop and they say, hang on, there's a wing that's missing here. All right? And along those lines, you need to treat it like that. You should be examining your boyfriend and your girlfriend from God's standpoint. Are they the kind of person that's going to help me get to heaven? Is the overall consideration that's being made during this time. Are they going to help me get to heaven? Don't shake your head. If you say no, dump him. All right? Don't act like I can't see you, by the way, okay? All right? Sometimes you do that. You say, he can't see me up there. He's blind. I wear glasses, but when I have them on, I'm not blind. All right? Okay. It is never too late until you say, I do. Never too late until you say, I do. Or less romantically, it's never too late until you sign the certificate. All right? I know of a man, and I think I told you this before, about a man in Melbourne who he was actually dating and even engaged to be married to a person that was a worldly person. And continually in their relationship, he was trying to put Christ first. He was always going to church services. He was always trying to do the right thing. And one day she just laid it out to him. All right, either you're going to go to church on Sunday or you're going to go somewhere with me. She was basically saying, all right, you're going to choose God or you're going to choose me. Engaged. Already announced it to everyone. Everyone knew. What did they do? What did he do? He chose God. And today he's not married to that woman. And thank God that he's not married to that woman. Because would he still be in the church? Would he still be faithful? He would have been putting himself under a great deal of pressure to not be, had he gone through with that. So, it's never too late until you say, I do. When I see someone, in fact, this is the rule for those of you who observe someone who's dating a non-Christian, until they get married, do everything that you can to break that relationship apart. But once they get married, do everything you can to keep that relationship together. That's the general rule of thumb that I'll give you along those lines. Let's ask some questions as we consider. These are questions that you need to be asking yourself about your relationship with this person. It's based upon what we're seeing here in the Song of Solomon. The first question that I want you to ask yourself in that relationship is, do you find yourself growing in respect for that person? You know, sometimes when you see, and in fact, this is usually how courting and dating happens, and you can dive in too quickly if you're not careful about this. You see someone and you just look across the pew and there's somebody at church. He's visiting from another congregation. She's coming from another congregation. You're together at camp perhaps. You've come together and you see that person in a beautiful setting. They're worshiping God. They're singing songs. They're praying. Maybe even they lead a prayer or lead a song or better yet, teach a lesson. And so you see them in that setting and you say, wow, that's a really nice person. I would like to know that person better. The danger is you walk up to that person and you say, will you be my girlfriend? Or, will you be my boyfriend? When you don't know that person. You don't know that person. You should do a bit of research, obviously. Talk to people who know that person. Are they putting on a show? Is that what they're really like? But you find out enough about that person, and then you say, all right, this is somebody that I want to pursue a relationship with. As that relationship progresses, do you see your respect growing? Or do you have reasons to not respect that person? Solomon, I have compared thee, O my love, to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots. Now, I don't know if you ladies would appreciate this today. Your man has just compared you to a bunch of horses. Yeah, okay, all right. And I'm going to try to find somebody else now, okay? No. Realize what he's doing here. Pharaoh's horses. Who is Pharaoh? Pharaoh in those days was virtual deity to the people he ruled over. Now, Solomon did not regard him as deity. That's not what I'm saying. But pharaohs were held in a level of respect as deity. Along those lines, sub-divine status was awarded to Pharaoh's horses. They had to be the absolute best. White horses were reserved for Pharaoh, and for only Pharaoh. And of the white horses, the only ones that he would dare be seen out with are the ones that are the best, the absolute best. King Solomon has a lot of people coming into his court to visit. And when he thinks about all of the majestic entrances that there ever was, when he thinks about all the people who have come before him, when he thinks about the best one, he thinks about Pharaoh. And he thinks about those beautiful white horses. He knows this woman now. And he respects her. He holds her in high regard. He compares her to something that he really enjoys. Can you do that for the person that you're dating or considering marrying? Can you say that I hold this person in that kind of high regard? Or do you find that your respect for that person is decreasing the more that you know them? Second question, do you find yourself growing in affection for that person? It should be that there is some love sickness there. It should be that there is some desire there. All right? I'm not saying that's the sole focus, and you're going to see from all of these questions that obviously it's not. And in fact, the purpose of this book is not just to create this sappy, over-the-top romance. That's not what it's all about. And I know that to some degree, some of that stuff to some of you might not speak as loudly as it does to someone from my culture or from other cultures that are more emotionally oriented. But along those lines, do you find yourself growing in affection? Before my wife and I even started dating, we actually wrote to each other. She found out that I was going to Australia, and she began to write me, and we wrote back and forth. And as we wrote back and forth, and I began to be more and more interested in this person. And I'm so glad she did it this way. She introduced herself before she sent me her photo. All right? If it had been the other way around, I might not have been as good at this. I probably would have said, I don't care what she is, she looks beautiful, you know? But she talked to me about this, about her likes, her dislikes, her interests. She talked to me about spiritual things. She talked to me about her church life and so on. We got to know each other. We wrote for 6 months before we ever met each other. And I found, you know, that towards somewhere along in that writing process, I remember that there was a time when I was separated from the computer for a while. I was on a road trip and I was traveling around, and I actually found that I missed her. I hadn't even met her, but I missed her. And that was a good sign. That was a very good sign. Do you miss this person? If you don't miss them now, you're certainly not going to miss them when you're married to them. Now, as you think about that, the Shulamite says, a bundle of myrrh is my well-beloved unto me. He shall lie all night between my breasts. 21st century understanding has to go out the window with that, all right? What is she saying? The ladies in those days used to perfume themselves, but not with a spray. They would actually carry a bag of spices, and they would put that bag of spices around their neck, just right here. It would set. So what did that symbolize? Something that was very precious to her. Something that was very, very important to her. Ladies would not be going out unless they had those. They didn't have showers back then, girls. Can you imagine? No washing your hair, all right? All right? Well, actually, I can't. I got to back up. I like showers, too. I probably take a longer shower than my wife does. But self-disclosing too much, probably. Sorry. But the bag of spices, she said, that's what you're like to me. You're like a bag of spices. You're like a cluster of campfire. You're like a bundle of flowers. Treasured, appreciated, precious. That's how she saw this person. Do you see your future Mr. or Mrs. in that same light? Do you find your self-worth increases or decreases around them? You need to get out if he makes fun of you. You need to get out if she mocks you and discourages you and says bad things about you in front of others while you're still dating. Because that will only get worse. And even though you might be able now to put on a brave face and give a smile, ha ha, yeah, that's true, I'm a bit fat, yeah, whatever. As that relationship goes on and she keeps saying those kind of things, your foundation is crumbling. You don't want to have that kind of self-image that's decreased by your spouse. You want to have that self-image that's increased by your spouse. You remember when we first saw the Shulamite? What did she say about herself? Don't look at me, I'm tan. But now what is she saying about herself? I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. The self-image has totally swung the other way. She sees herself appropriately. She views herself as being precious. Why does she view herself as being precious? Because Solomon has made her feel that way. Solomon hasn't insulted her. Solomon hasn't degraded her. Solomon hasn't told a joke where he's the only one laughing. He has made her feel like a better woman. Does your future Mr. or Mrs. make you feel that same way? Does he or she focus on you and you alone? You know, after she says that about herself, I believe Solomon then responds by saying, as the lily among thorns, so is my love among the daughters. Ladies, especially, you can do this with your men. It's not as easy with men, but increasingly it is. Ladies, when you're going out with your man and a lady walks past, watch his eyes. Men are like, Patrick, be quiet! Be quiet! Don't say that! Watch his eyes. Watch what they do. Do they stay on you or do they look at her? If he can't look at you and focus on you now, he will not be able to do so after you get married. You want someone who focuses on you. And when he looks at you, he sees you as the lily. Everyone else, what are they? Thorns. Thorns. And you say, well, that's not realistic, Patrick. I know that so-and-so is more beautiful. I know that so-and-so is hotter. I know that so-and-so looks better, or whatever. You know, all right, physically speaking, that may or may not be true. But it depends upon whose scale or what gauge you're going by. It should be that he looks at you and he sees a lily and he sees everyone else and he says they're thorns. That's the way that it should be. And if he's not doing that, or if she's not doing that, if she has the hunk of the week posted up on Facebook, you know, and she's going, wow, that guy's hot. Well, that's just as bad. All right? Run away from that girl. Run away from that boy. Next. Do you benefit emotionally, intellectually, physically, and spiritually from the relationship that you have with this future Mr. or Mrs.? When she considered him as the apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved among the sons. He says of her, you're the lily, all of them are the thorns. She says to him, you're my apple tree. When I'm around you, I feel safe. I feel protected. I feel like I'm feeding off of you. I feel like I'm getting better around you. Iron sharpens iron. Is that the way you feel about your future Mr. or Mrs.? Do you feel yourself getting better around them? Do you feel that you are going to be safe in their love? It's an interesting question. It should be, like we said, that you're getting better. Your self-image is not only increasing, but your total person is becoming a better person because you're around them. And a person is a person four ways: intellectually, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Are you becoming a better person around them? And is your relationship an open book? Is your relationship an open book? I knew of a girl who was dating a young man, and whenever they were long distance dating, and she would go and visit him. And whenever she would come into town, he would introduce her as my friend. Now, I don't know if you do it the same way that we do it in America, but if she's your girlfriend, you say girlfriend. If she's your friend, that's something different altogether. To her, he said, "You're my girlfriend." To everyone else, he said, "You're my friend." What was that relationship? It was nothing. It was absolutely nothing. When she considered him, he brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. A banner, or an ensign, is something that a king used to mark his presence. In other words, it's very obvious along those lines. We sometimes sing the song, or maybe not as often here in Singapore, there's an ensign fair. There's an ensign fair or a banner fair. Well, what were we talking about there? Holding up the banner of Christ. Well, when she comes into the banqueting house, when she comes into his house, and all the other people are around there, does he say, "This is my friend"? No, he says, "This is my beloved." And that's the language they use of each other. They don't say boyfriend, girlfriend. "This is my beloved." She says, his banner over me is love. It's not a secret relationship. It's not a hidden thing. It's something that's open. It's something that's honest, as it should be. 3 more questions, and then I'm going to leave this lesson with you this evening. That is, first of all, does the person you are dating have personal devotional habits? Obviously, there are things outside of the book of Song of Solomon that I want you to consider along these lines. Do they have personal devotional habits? Second, is the person you are dating active in church activities and regular in church attendance? If you're preparing to marry someone and you're not right now, if they're members of this same congregation, if they're not sitting next to you, something is wrong. Something is wrong. Already something is wrong in your relationship. You're not on the same page. And that gap will only broaden with time. Third, do you share the same goals in life, physically and spiritually? We'll talk more about, as we think about preparing ourselves for marriage and the kind of questions that we need to ask more practically along those lines. We'll deal with that in 2 weeks' time. But already, as you consider this person that you're considering for marriage, do they have the same goals in life? You're going to need for them to be on the same page. So many questions that could possibly be asked, but I hope that having this glance into the Song of Solomon has caused you to see that beauty is more than skin deep. And if you are going to worship, if you're going to look for someone to be your spouse wisely, then you're going to have to forget about the way the world does it. The world dates to fail. You date to find the winners. And my hope and prayer for you is that God will bless you to find a mate that not only preserves your current spiritual state, but also promotes that, causes it to grow, causes it to increase. Thank you for your attention this evening.